Yeah, so this evening's talk will begin in India, 2,500 years ago, and in a northern town called Shravasti. And Shravasti at this time was the capital of a place called Kosala, which was in the central Ganges River. A very kind of important hub, trading hub. And in the centre of Shravasti, there's a man who's desperately looking for the Buddha. He's urgently looking for the Buddha. And his name is Bahir. And the reason that Bahir is desperately, urgently looking for the Buddha is because he, some days and weeks ago, had a disturbing vision. He'd been sitting at home. Bahir was a holy man. He was a spiritual man, and he was somebody who was seeking the truth and seeking enlightenment. And he'd been doing this for some time, and he'd sat at home and just wondered to himself, I've been doing this for a long time. I wonder if I'm enlightened. I wonder if I'm one of the enlightened ones. And it said that what happened is that he had a vision of a dead relative, and a dead relative appeared to him and said to him, Bahir, you're not one of the enlightened ones. And he said more than that. He said, you're not one of the enlightened ones, and you're not on the path to enlightenment, and nothing that you've done so far has got you close to enlightenment. So this came as quite a shock to Bahir. He was quite a mature person. The practice he'd done had some effect, and he wasn't kind of indignant or perplexed. He just said to this dead relative, well, is there anybody who is an enlightened one who's alive? And this relative said, yes. In the northern city of Shravasti, there's a man called Gautama, the Buddha, who is awake, who is awakened, who is enlightened. And basically at that, Bahir he dropped his life, he left everything and just walked as quickly as he could from the west coast of India to northern India, to Shravasti. It said without stopping for a night, it says in the sutras, he just walked until he got to the place where the Buddha was dwelling in Shravasti. And then he got to the place where the Buddha's camp was, where the Buddha's followers were staying, called Jetta's Grove. And he asked for the Buddha, and he was told, well, the Buddha isn't here. He's out collecting, he's begging for food in the village. That's what the Buddha does, is begs for food in the village, so he's doing that. And he doesn't like to be disturbed whilst he's begging for food, so just wait here and we'll take care of you, you'll be back soon. But Bahir was so keen, so desperate to see the Buddha urgently, he wouldn't wait. He strode into Shravasti. And I've been reading this book by Vishvapani called Gautama Buddha, and it starts with this account, and I really highly recommend this to you. I'm just digressing to recommend this book. And what Vishvapani says is he paints a picture of Shravasti. He starts with this encounter, and he paints a picture of Shravasti as just being a very kind of bustling, busy trading town full of people, full of cattle, kind of chariots, people selling stuff. And I've been to Shravasti with some others on a pilgrimage, and I know what those kind of busy Indian towns are like. Just very, very busy, lots going on. And Bahir is desperately trying to force his way through all these crowds, all these kind of different people and animals to find the Buddha. And then he sees the Buddha and instantly recognises him. He's never seen him before, but we're told that instantly he recognises this man is the Buddha. This is the man I've been looking for. And he's described as being pleasing, lovely to see, with calmed senses, tranquil mind, possessing perfect poise and calm. So from this, just seeing the way the Buddha's carrying himself, Bahir knows this is the man I'm looking for. And he goes straight to the Buddha, he throws himself on the floor and says, please teach me, please teach me. And the Buddha says to Bahir, well, I don't like to teach and speak to people while I'm begging for food, so I'll teach you in a little while. But Bahir is so desperate, he's so urgent, he just urgently wants to have the teaching, so he says again to the Buddha, please teach me, please teach me. And the Buddha says a second time, I'm busy now, I'm collecting alms food, but I'll teach you just in a little while. But the Bahir asks a third time, and traditionally in the suttas, if someone asks the Buddha 3 times, or the Buddha says something, if anything happens 3 times, basically it's quite significant and auspicious. So Bahir asks a third time, please teach me. And he says something more. He says, well, we don't know how long we're going to be alive for. I don't know how long I'm going to be alive for, and how long you're going to be alive for. Please just teach me now. So the Buddha stops what he's doing in this doorway, begging for food, and just turns and looks at Bahir and says just a small number of verses, which I'll read out. Bahir, you should train yourself thus. In the seen will be merely what is seen. In the heard will be merely what is heard. In the sensed will be merely what is sensed. In the cognized will be merely what is cognized. In this way should you train yourself, Bahir. Then, Bahir, you are not in that. When you are not in that, then you will be neither here nor beyond, nor between the two. Just this is the end of suffering. And I'm going to read what Vishwapani says next, because I don't think I can say it better. A sudden moment of communion cocoons the men beyond time or place, and something happens to Bahir. Exactly what is hard to say, but its effect is shattering. It is bound up with the meaning of Gautama's words, but that meaning is mixed with the sense that Gautama himself embodies them completely, and is inwardly expanded into the open spaces they disclose. A shift occurs deep in Bahir's consciousness, a silent opening. And then the moment is over, the street noises return, Bahir walks away, and Gautama returns quietly to his arms round. Yeah, so I wanted to start just with that kind of intense, dramatic encounter between Bahir and the Buddha. And we're told that from that encounter, Bahir was enlightened, he became fully awakened. Just from that encounter, those verses and that encounter with the Buddha, he became fully awakened, he became enlightened. So a very, very dramatic and intense encounter. So I always wanted to start the story, the talk with that story, because I've been asked to talk about the Buddha as a symbol of the goal, and I want to come back to that story, but also, well, ask the question, why is the Buddha important to us as Buddhists? Why is the Buddha an important figure? So I want to come back to that question, and to come back to the question, well, why even concentrate on the goal? Why do we need to focus on the goal? Why do we need to focus on the Buddha? But before I do that, I just want to recap where we've been over the last few weeks with the help of this bit of technology. There's a picture of the Buddha, which I'll be coming back to. But we've been focusing for some time on the wheel of life. So we've got a series of talks on the wheel, the spiral, and the goal. So we looked a number of weeks at the wheel of life, which just showed us our situation that we find ourselves in according to the Buddha, according to Buddhists, one of suffering. And basically the wheel of life showed us how suffering is caused, the causes of suffering, how we get trapped in the same habitual ways of behaviour, and those habitual ways of behaviour create the same experience of suffering. So we saw that, we spent quite some time actually looking in detail at the teaching of the wheel of life, unpacking that symbol. And then the last couple of weeks we began to look at actually how we escape from the wheel of life. So the whole point of the wheel of life is to escape. And a couple of weeks ago Vidanya was looking at, there's a point on the wheel of life which we call the point of freedom, or the gap, which is where basically we can escape from this conditioned existence, or begin to, and the spiritual life begins. We can begin the spiritual life. And Maitradasa last week focused on this spiral path. The spiral path, which instead of going round and round on the same level of consciousness, takes us to higher and higher and higher levels of consciousness. The more we practice on the spiritual path, on the Dharma path, the more our consciousness is raised and expanded to higher and higher levels. So Maitradasa unpacked that a little bit last week, and focused particularly on the start of the spiral path, of the response in ourselves called Shraddha, a response which is the response in us of something higher, something ultimate in the universe, and our kind of, it's sometimes translated as faith, but that's a bit of a misleading translation. It's our was our confidence in what's higher, our trust in it, and our desire to move towards it. So that's where the spiritual life begins. And the spiral path takes us through higher and higher levels of consciousness, eventually to Buddhahood, to awakening. That's the goal of Buddhism, is complete enlightenment, to become like the Buddha. To become like the Buddha. So, why is there so much fuss placed on the Buddha? Why do we have shrines of the Buddha? Why do we have statues of the Buddha, pictures of the Buddha? Because we're very clear, the Buddha himself was very clear, well, he said he wasn't a god, the Buddha isn't a god. And we make this clear in week 1 of the beginner's course. We say, well, we don't worship the Buddha as a god, as Buddhists. So why do we bother having these shrines and these images and these rupas? What is that all about? Why is it even important to focus on the goal? And I think there's a very good answer. There's an answer that sums it up really well for me, captures it very well. It was when Sangharakshita, who founded this order and this community, when he was training, before he even started his training, when he was a very, very young man, a teenager in India, he found himself surrounded by Hindus, and there's one Hindu called Swami Ramdas, and Sangharakshita describes an account of meeting this guy called Swami Ramdas and being involved in a questions and answer discussion. And there's one question that really stayed with Sangharakshita, and it stayed with me as well, the answer to it. Because a questioner in the audience said to Swami Ramdas, well, why do so few people actually make progress in the spiritual life? So it's a very important question if you yourself want to make progress. Why do so few people make progress? And Swami Ramdas's answer was very straightforward. He said there was 2 things. One is they haven't got a clear idea of the goal. And the second thing, they haven't got a clear idea of how to get there. So it's quite straightforward actually. You need to have a clear idea of the goal and a clear idea of how to get there, and then you'll make progress. So this evening's talk is primarily focused on that really, the goal. Why we focus on the goal and what that tells us about how to get there. Yeah, so when the Buddha spoke those words to Bahia, those very few verses, Bahia, it said, awoke, became fully enlightened like the Buddha. So just want to ask a quick question. Did anybody become enlightened when I read those words out? See me afterwards. Because I've read those words and heard those words a lot of times, and I haven't become enlightened. So why? And it seems like, well, probably not many people here became enlightened either through those words. So why was it that Bahia did become enlightened when he heard those words? I think there's 2 reasons, at least 2 reasons. But one is Bahia himself and his sense of urgency and his receptivity, and he was just really primed. He really was listening. He really wanted to hear that teaching. He really was able to take it to heart fully. And the second one was that it was the Buddha saying those words. It wasn't just the words themselves. The Buddha himself was saying those words to Bahia, and the fact that it was the Buddha saying those words had such an impact on Bahia. The Buddha's followers, they had the teachings of the Buddha to practice. They had the path of the Dharma and the teachings of the Buddha, but they also had the Buddha himself as an example. So they had a walking example of enlightenment. They had an embodiment of enlightenment, somebody who everything they did was the action of an enlightened being. And if we're trying to develop something in ourselves, it's just a lot easier if we can see those. If we're trying to develop qualities, it's a lot easier to see those if we see those qualities embodied in another being, exemplified in another being. It can inspire us and draw those qualities out of us. We can see those qualities externalized in another being. I was thinking of when I first started to come to the Buddhist Centre and listen to Dharma talks. I learned a lot from the Dharma talks, but I also realised I learned more from watching Amoghavanksa interact with people, because I could see how he embodied a lot of what I was hearing about. I was hearing about friendliness, selflessness, generosity, and I thought, well, I can just watch how Amoghavanksa does it and copy him, or kind of just see what he does with people, see what he does with me. So I think if you have a person who embodies qualities and to a lot higher extent than you do, you can see them and they can be drawn out of you. So it's important to have an embodiment of the goal to help us to have a clear idea of what the goal is. And when we do, I'm involved with school visits with Dave and with Garva and with Kate, who's back doing it now, which is great. And when we go into schools or schools come here and they ask us about shrines, why do we have a shrine of the Buddha? I often say to them, or I would say to them, well, who have you got a picture of on your wall at home? And some of them might say, for the boys, they might say, well, they used to say David Beckham or Cristiano Ronaldo or a pop star that I'd never heard of before. and I would say to them, well, who do you want to be when you grow up? And they would say that, the same thing, Cristiano Ronaldo, or I want to be like this pop star. And I'd say, well, in the same way, we have a picture of the Buddha, we have a shrine of the Buddha. And when I was little, when I was younger, actually not so little, I was about 11 or 12, I wanted to be like John Barnes. This is John Barnes. And he was a footballer for Liverpool. And in my eyes, he was my idol. He was amazing. And what I wanted to be was to be able to play football like John Barnes. And he scored this goal when he was playing for England against Brazil. I've circled him. And Brazil were this famous for being able to dribble and had real skill. And John Barnes was an English player. And he scored a goal in the Brazilian national stadium, the Maracanã Stadium, where he dribbled around nearly the whole Brazilian team and then scored a goal. It was in a friendly, but it became immortalised for me as just an amazing football player. So I wanted to be like John Barnes when I grew up. And when I was playing football, sometimes I'd be having an average game, but then I'd bring to mind John Barnes, I'd think of John Barnes, and all of a sudden I'd be inspired and I'd go on a little mazy run and I'd take on lots of players. In my imagination I was taking on lots of players and scoring the same kind of goal that John Barnes had scored. And there was one time in training that I scored a quite technically difficult back heel, and at about 12 or 13, and the coach had said, that made some joke about that must have been by accident. And I said, no, I saw John Barnes doing it on Match of the Day the week before, and I copied it. And he didn't believe me that I honestly did it. So I suppose, and then that's one example. The second example I thought of was of Nigel Kennedy, who was a violinist. And I also used to, as well as playing football, the other thing I used to do was play the violin when I was younger. And I was more interested in playing football, but my mum would force me to play the violin and drag me off the streets from playing football and make me practice the violin, which at the time I resented, but I'm very grateful for now because I know how to play the violin and other musical instruments. But one of the things that made me more interested and inspired to play the violin was when Nigel Kennedy released a recording of the Four Seasons, and it was very popular in the charts and on TV. And I could see somebody who seemed more like me that played the violin. He supported Aston Villa, and he played the violin really, really well. And it was just I used to listen to it. I was doing the paper rounds, Nigel Kennedy playing the Four Seasons, and I wanted to play that music. So I asked my violin teacher, I want to play that music. Can I play that music? And she got me a copy of the music, and I became inspired to practice it. I learned to play it, and I learned to play some other more complicated pieces, some violin concertos. And I started to enjoy it more, and my parents bought me a better violin. And so it was basically just, again, an example of seeing what I could be embodied by somebody else and wanting to be like that. It's just really, really important. If you aspire towards something, but you can see somebody else who's already doing it and doing it very, very well, that it gives you inspiration, it gives you something to aim towards, to move towards. So there are two kind of mundane examples, but they are examples of that, showing that, we have latent kind of qualities within us, almost like nascent qualities within us, and they become activated, they become stirred when we see those qualities around us in the world, embodied, exemplified by other people. And it's this responsiveness that gets stirred when we encounter something better than us, than we already are, higher than what we already are. Is that same responsiveness that Majidasa talked about last week when he talked about Shraddha, which is the start of the spiritual path, the start of the spiral path. And I feel justified to say this because Subhuti says it in a series of talks, that even admiring beautiful football or creative football is the beginnings of that responsiveness. If we can see something creative or beautiful, even in football, well, that kind of faculty, that bit of us that responds to that, eventually will be developed and will respond to moral values, to ethical values, or to beauty, or to things that are more refined. And eventually that faculty becomes Shraddha, which responds, the faculty that responds to Buddhist principles, to the truth, to examples of the truth, embodiments of the truth, to ethical values. So we've talked about the wheel of life and the gap. But if you find yourself in the gap, if you are, I was going to say lucky, but it's not really luck, if you're aware enough to find yourself in the gap, what are you going to do? Is if you're not going to just do what you've always done habitually, if you're not going to do the same old habitual behaviours, the same old patterns of behaviour, what are you going to do instead? You've got to choose a different way of being. And we asked this question on week 3 of the beginner's course, and we asked people to bring to mind somebody they admire, someone that they would like to be like. And you get a whole range of different responses shouted out. You get, Doctor Who, my Aunt Mavis, my sister, Gandhi. You get a whole range of responses. And what we say to people is, okay, well, if you want to be like your Aunt Mavis, think of 3 ways that she behaves, and then you can behave in those ways. And it's almost like, it's working back, using karma to work backwards and say, okay, if we want to become a certain way, how do we need to behave now in order to bring that future about? So if you want to be like Aunt Mavis or John Barnes or whoever it is, how do you need to behave to become more like that person? And for Buddhists, our vision of the goal, who we want to become when we grow up as Buddhists, is the Buddha. The Buddha embodies the kind of pinnacle of human growth, human development for Buddhists. The pinnacle of human evolution is represented by, embodied, exemplified by the Buddha. So this is why we have shrines. This is why we salute the shrine before we do any period of practice. This is why we have verses of puja, of devotion, to try and connect with the example of the Buddha, and for that to be drawn out of us, for those qualities of enlightenment that are nascent and latent within us to be stirred, activated and drawn out of us. And there are the words in the threefold puja which I love, and we chant at mitra ceremonies, which one of the verses says, "We are born as the Buddha was born. What the Buddha overcame, we too can attain. And what the Buddha overcame, we too can overcome. And what the Buddha attained, we too can attain." So this evening, that's what I'm going to be doing for the rest of the talk, is just looking at what are the qualities that are embodied by the Buddha, and how can we draw those out of ourselves. In a way, getting clear about what is the goal of Buddhism and how we can get there, because I want you to make progress. I want me to make progress. So we need to be clear about what is the goal and how do we get there. So the first quality, I plan to have a flip chart and I've forgotten it, so pretend there's a flip chart, and the flip chart says wisdom. So the first quality is wisdom, as it says on my imaginary flip chart. And I just wanted to revisit this teaching, this kind of, in a way, this story of the Buddha encountering Bahia, and these verses that the Buddha says to Bahia, which cause him just such great change and transformation in his being. And these verses, "In the seen, there is merely what is seen, only what is seen. In the heard, only what is heard. And in the sensed, only what is sensed." So what was the Buddha communicating? And I have to be honest, I don't know fully what the Buddha was communicating, because what he was communicating was beyond those words. He was using those words to say to Bahia what he needed to say for Bahia to experience it as well. But the words are kind of a vehicle, a bridge to the Buddha's experience. And we can get a sense of a glimpse of what the Buddha might have been communicating in that moment. And it's about what we add or remove from our experience in a way. We all the time we're experiencing stuff. And rather than just experience what's happening, we add stories and labels and all kinds of stuff to what's happening. And then we end up not really experiencing what's happening. We experience our stories and our labels. And that causes all kinds of problems, all kinds of suffering, all kinds of mess. And when we don't do that, quite a lot of the suffering will drop away. And so, yeah, right. So if I'm giving a talk and somebody leaves the talk, somebody gets up and walks out, that happens sometimes, it might happen this evening, I might think, gosh, this person's walked out, this is a stinker of a talk, this is going really badly, what's going wrong, oh dear, and things like that. Those kind of thoughts would come up in response to that person leaving the room, but I've got no idea actually why the person's left the room. They might be they might plan to leave early, they might really need the toilet, they might be unwell. All kinds of things can be going on, but I've added a story to the experience and changed the experience and created all kinds of suffering for myself. So in a way, there's, what part of what the Buddha's wisdom, part of what the Buddha saw, part of the Buddha's wisdom is this, that there is only what we're experiencing. So right now I'm giving a talk, and we've got this idea that there's a talk and I'm giving the talk, you're listening to the talk. But actually what I'm saying isn't what I'm planning, what I thought I was going to say. Sometimes I say things that I don't realise I've said. And so the talk I'm giving isn't the talk I think I'm giving a lot of the time. And then, there's 65, something like that, of you in the room, each hearing a different talk. You're all hearing your own version of the talk, and some of you will like it, some of you won't like it. Some of you will say, remember that bit Bodhinaga said, another bit people won't remember that bit or won't have even said it. There'll be 65 different versions of the talk happening. So, just a little bit of unpacking of that verse. There's a lot in that verse, but it's a glimpse that the Buddha was a very wise man. The Buddha saw things very different. He perceived things very differently to how we might perceive things. And he could see how we cause and create suffering for ourselves and how we could stop doing that. And he was able in those, that just very brief moment, the Buddha only saw Bahia once for a few minutes, and in that, he was able to really transform the way Bahia saw things with those words. But what I want to do is explore qualities of the Buddha, but also symbolic hand gestures of the Buddha. I've been asked to do that as well. And this is one called the earth-touching mudra. So a mudra, and so imagine on the flip chart, M-U-D-R-A, mudra. A mudra is a hand gesture of the Buddha. And you'll see on lots of different statues, they've all got the Buddhas are doing different things with their hands. And they're each trying to evoke, in the same way I'm going to try and do with stories and other things, different qualities of the Buddha. The hand gestures also evoke those qualities. So the quality of the Buddha's wisdom is probably most closely symbolised by what's called the earth-touching mudra, where the Buddha touches the earth in this way on the statue there and also on the statue here. Again, you've got to just try and unpack what the symbol communicates for you as best you can on a level that works for you. But there's something about that gesture that shows the Buddha's relationship to everything around him, that he's not separate from everything around him, he's connected to everything around him, he's touching the earth, and in that gesture he's uniting himself with everything around him. Because one of the most important stories that we can add on to our experience is that I'm here having this experience and you're out there separate from me and you're not very important because I'm very important. And we all, without realising it, add that story onto our experience. That's what the Buddha taught anyway, that we add this experience of this story of being separate from each other onto our experience. And we have this kind of, untrue story which causes lots of suffering. And so for me the gesture of touching the earth shows that the Buddha has seen through that story, he's connected with everything around him. And it said that makes the Buddha unshakable. That's also associated with this gesture. Unshakable, unmovable, unperturbable. The Buddha's wisdom just makes him unflappable, unperturbable, unmovable, unshakable, like a mountain. And there was some verses in the Dhammapada which compare this. They say, well, somebody who's hasn't got a strong sense of confidence in the teaching, they're not. Actually, I'll read the verse. It'd be better if I read the verse. It's verse 7 and 8. I'll paraphrase it. As the wind blows down a weak tree, so one who sees what is unlovely as lovely, whose senses are uncontrolled, who is immoderate in food, lazy, and of inferior vigour, is overthrown. So basically, if you're like a weak tree. If you're not like the Buddha, you're like a weak tree that is easily blown over. But if you are like the Buddha, if your senses are controlled, you're moderate in food, you've got a strong sense of Shraddha, you're like a mountain peak that can't be blown over. So, yeah, you've got, this evokes that, this just gesture of touching the earth evokes that quality of just being, the Buddha was completely unshakable, completely unmovable, unflappable. So as well as being wise, he's also an unshakable, quite a striking character. I suppose if Bahia is able to recognise the Buddha in this crowded town square, there must have been something quite striking about the Buddha, quite noticeable about the Buddha. And he was described as being mountain-like. Sometimes he's also described as being like an elephant, or a bull of a man. There's another. I wasn't planning to say this, but there's a title of the Buddha that is given called Mahapurush, which means the big guy, the big man, which I really like. It's almost like, it sounds like a mafia boss. The big guy, Mahapurush. But you get this sense of somebody who's got real presence, really stands out, and Bahia was able to notice him. So the qualities of the Buddha to draw out are his wisdom and his unshakability. But it can feel a bit heady actually when you talk about kind of seeing things and not adding things on and noticing our experience. It can feel quite intellectual, quite heady to me. And so it's important to balance that out by looking at what emotionally was the Buddha like. And Sangha actually has said something which I again think is very important, that we need to find emotional equivalents to intellectual understandings. So what would be the emotional equivalent to the Buddha's wisdom? What were the Buddha's emotions like? If he was reporting in, what would his feelings be like? As we do this thing in Triratna where we report into each other, we tell each other about our feelings sometimes. And if the Buddha was reporting in, what would his feelings be like? What would his emotions be like? And I think as I was saying just there about the Buddha's interconnectedness, the key story that he's seen through is this story about a separation, a barrier, a rigid barrier between self and other. And the Buddha's seen through that, and that leads to compassion. The emotional equivalent of the Buddha's wisdom is compassion, or karuna. And it said, the Buddha himself said that he trembled, he shook when he thought about the suffering of beings. He physically trembled. There's this word anukampa, this trembling with beings, resonating with beings. So the Buddha's compassion, his emotional response to what he saw, was a physical response, an emotional response of compassion, wanting to help other people. And in order to explore this quality, I don't think it's appropriate just with one person, an example of one person, or even with two people, but it's more appropriate to explore the Buddha's compassion and this quality, emotional quality of the Buddha with the relationship between two people. So I want to look at the relationship between the Buddha and Ananda. So, some people may not have heard of the Buddha or Ananda. Who were they? So, Ananda was the Buddha's attendant for the last 25 years of his life, a very, very close friend and companion of the Buddha. So Ananda went everywhere that the Buddha went for the final 25 years of his life. The Buddha usually had a companion. He had a whole range of companions. Some of them were reliable, some of them were less reliable. There's stories of some of the Buddha's different companions. But Ananda was the most famous and best of the Buddha's attendants and companions. And I think just the fact that the Buddha had a companion is really interesting. It illustrates quite a lot as well. The Buddha he chose to spend his time with another close friend, with other people. Because we get the sense of, an enlightened one or insight as being kind of maybe like an isolated, aloof, kind of cold thing, that it's about us and not about other people. But this illustrates for me that enlightenment is expressed as friendship, it's expressed with other people, it's expressed in relationship with other people. And I love this painting. It's a recent painting done by an order member, Amita Jyoti. Thank you, Amita Jyoti. And it was commissioned by the Birmingham Buddhist Centre, or some order members in Birmingham, so it's on display in Birmingham. It's a life-size painting. And what they wanted was to try and capture the Buddha as he might have looked as an Indian man, with Ananda as another Indian man, towards the end of their life as elderly men. and just the friendship that existed between them. And I really like the way this painting captures a sense of friendship and love between Ananda and the Buddha. Ananda just helping the Buddha along. He's very old, he's very frail, just walking barefoot on the dusty roads through the Indian towns. And when, there's lots of stories that illustrate the Buddha's and Ananda's relationship and the Buddha's compassion, but one of the things I really like, there's two stories. One is when the Buddha and Ananda were walking along one day like this together, and they were talking about the spiritual life, the Dharma life, and Ananda said to the Buddha, this teaching of spiritual friendship, Kalyana Mitrata, spiritual friendship with what is auspicious and lovely and beautiful, this is an important teaching of yours, Buddha, Lord. I think this teaching is half of the spiritual life. That's how important it is. It's half of the spiritual life. And the Buddha said to Ananda, don't say that, Ananda. Don't say that. This teaching of spiritual friendship is the whole of the spiritual life. This spiritual friendship is the whole of the spiritual life, which is quite a thing for the Buddha to say. The whole of the Dharma life is spiritual friendship. And there's a lot to unpack in that bit whole of the talk, so I'm not going to unpack that. But it's quite a big statement of the Buddha's that the whole of the spiritual life is friendship. And then there was when the Buddha was dying on his deathbed, and Ananda was overcome with grief. He was weeping and wailing, overcome with grief. And what he said was, he who has been so kind to me is going to die. He who has been so kind to me is going to die. And he was overcome with grief. And the Buddha's response, the Buddha was dying, he was in lots of pain, but his response was to just to reassure and to comfort Ananda and to rejoice in Ananda's merits, to rejoice in the merits of Ananda. He heaped praise onto Ananda, said, don't worry, Ananda, you've lived a very selfless life, you understand the teachings, you will become enlightened very soon. And he just wanted to, there was this exchange of love and of rejoicing in each other, between each other, this kind of flow of friendship and rejoicing between the Buddha and Ananda. And there's a story that illustrates their kind of compassionate friendship, as the two of them were walking along just visiting a company of monks, a community of the Buddha's followers, and they came across a monk who was sick and who was sick, basically had dysentery. So they found that this monk was on his own, he was covered in excrement and urine and unable to move, he was very, very sick. And they said to the monk, well, what's the matter? And he said, the Buddha said to the monk, what's the matter? And the monk said, I've got dysentery, Lord. And the Buddha said, well, why is nobody helping you? And the monk said, because I'm not useful to them, Lord, I'm no use to them. And so the Buddha's response was immediate, very direct and very practical. And what he did, he said to Ananda, go and fetch some warm water. So Ananda went and fetched some warm water, and together they washed and bathed the sick monk, clothed him, and lifted him back onto his bed. So the Buddha lifted his head, Ananda lifted his feet, and they placed him back on his bed. And they made sure he was well and comfortable, and then the Buddha gathered all the local community of his followers around and told them off, basically. He just said, you need to look after each other. You've gone forth from your previous lifestyles, what you've got is each other, you need to take care of each other. So the Buddha, what you can see is his very direct, practical, compassionate response, that what he wasn't bothered about, he didn't call a meeting and find out what had happened, he just straight away cleaned up the monk, him and Ananda worked as a team, they didn't divide up and say, what do you feel like doing, Ananda? They didn't kind of, just divide the tasks up like we might do, they just worked as a team, did what needed to be done, looked after the monk. So again, this shows a quality of compassion and kindness. And interestingly, the hand gesture that's most closely connected with this quality that we'll draw out. The reason I'm using these hand gestures is we're going to link these to a future talk in a couple of weeks' time. So pay attention to the hand gestures. What you see is the Buddha with his hands in meditation gesture. This is another statue of the Buddha with his hands in a meditation gesture. So why is the practice of meditation associated with compassion and kindness? And when I was at Padmaloka a couple of weeks ago, and there's an order member who's very important to me called Satyaraja, and he's been an important guide and friend over the past few years. And I really rate his teaching on meditation, I really value his teaching on meditation. And he was saying recently that a lot of people training to be ordained have got the wrong idea about meditation. He thinks that a lot of people see meditation as being about having an experience or some kind of experience. And so if their meditation doesn't have some kind of big experience, it's been a bad meditation. And he's saying, well, that's not what meditation is about. Meditation is about retraining your mind over a long period of time. So it's like weight training or going to the gym. You have to do it every day, and often you have to do a lot of it. And bit by bit, you're retraining your heart and your mind. So that instead of going around the wheel with the same responses, you respond differently. You're training yourself to respond differently. So meditation is like a cauldron where we are transformed, our responses, our emotions are transformed and reshaped. And he said the same is true with Vipassana, with insight meditation. We're reshaping the way we see reality very, very gradually, very steadily over time. We're just reshaping the way we look at reality. So meditation is about developing compassion very, very gradually over time, developing kindness very, very gradually over time. Metta, the metta bhavana and awareness is something we gradually develop over time. So there's two points to draw out from that. One is that Buddha was kind and compassionate, and the second is that we'll meditate a lot and often, because that's how we become more kind and compassionate. Okay, so the next thing on the flip chart says fearlessness, and for me this is another implication of how the Buddha saw things. The Buddha's wisdom was that he wasn't afraid of anything or anybody. He wasn't afraid of new experiences. He wasn't afraid of doing something outside of the ordinary. So he could be endlessly creative. There was no limits to who he could be, what he did. He wasn't afraid of other people because he no longer saw people as threatening or as a threat or a challenge to him. In fact, what he saw people was potential Buddhas. He saw everybody with a special kind of awareness, which saw everybody's potential qualities, how everybody could become awakened and enlightened. And he wasn't afraid of death either, which I'll come to when I talk again about the Buddha's final weeks and months. So there's a hand gesture. Oh, there's the Buddha again. There's a hand gesture called the Abhaya Mudra, the gesture of fearlessness. And this is if you see this hand gesture on a statue of the Buddha, it's communicating, it's conveying that the Buddha wasn't afraid. He wasn't afraid of anything, of anybody, of any experience. Fearlessness. And there's lots to reflect in these qualities, but when I reflected on partly why the Buddha wasn't afraid, and it's that he's faced what was most terrifying in himself. He'd faced and accepted, become challenged, transformed what was most terrifying in himself. So he no longer had anything to fear in himself. And he had nothing to fear in other people. He could face what was most terrifying in other people and help them to face it. And he'd also faced what we might find most terrifying about reality. And he wasn't scared of that, and he could help other people to face what we find terrifying about reality. So the Buddha was fearless, and he could help other people be fearless. I just want to tell a quick story about the Buddha, which was that towards the end of his life, his cousin, he had a nasty cousin called Devadatta, and Devadatta wanted to kill the Buddha because he wanted to be in charge of the Sangha, basically. He wanted to take charge. He wanted to be in charge of Buddhism, not the Buddha. So he wanted to kill the Buddha and take charge of the community. So he hatched a plot, and he tried lots of different things, which didn't work, fortunately. One of the things he tried was to send a host of assassins to kill the Buddha whilst he was contemplating on his own, without Ananda, on his own in the forest. So it's a longish story, and I'll cut it short because I'm talking more than I should be. But the first assassin goes and creeps up to the Buddha. He takes his weapons, his bow and arrow, and he creeps up to where the Buddha is sitting. And it's interesting, what happens is, rather than the Buddha becoming terrified of the assassin notices the Buddha again. Mahapurush, he becomes aware of this big presence, and he's frightened actually. He realises this is a powerful man. And the Buddha, the assassin, becomes very, very afraid. And the Buddha senses this. The Buddha senses there's somebody there who's frightened, and he says, "Come, friend, don't be afraid." And the assassin comes to the Buddha and gets into conversation with the Buddha and becomes a disciple of the Buddha, rather than being an assassin trying to kill the Buddha. And so at this point, the other assassins are wondering what's happened. So they think, gosh, this Buddha must be quite a mean fighter. We'll send more assassins than one. So they send half of the remaining assassins go to see what's happened. And then again, they see the Buddha and this assassin seated side by side, and they're terrified. They become overcome with fear. And again, the Buddha beckons them and says, "Don't be afraid, come along, friends." And they become his disciples. So you can guess what happens. All of the assassins become disciples of the Buddha. And they're very sorry that they try to kill the Buddha, but they become disciples, followers of the Buddha. And for me, it's all these qualities combined, really. It's the quality of fearlessness, not being afraid of other people, not being afraid of what other people might do, but seeing people through compassion and with wisdom, seeing them as potential Buddhas, seeing them that they are everybody, no matter what they've done, what they might want to do. Everybody has a potential to awaken, to become a Buddha. And the Buddha knew what to say to people. He knew how to engage people. He knew what to do to people, how to communicate with them, to draw them out. And part of it actually is that stories are co-created. So if the assassins had gone along and the Buddha said, "Oh gosh, you're an assassin, I'm scared," then that kind of situation, that dynamic, is unchallenged. But if you don't relate to somebody as they expect to be related to, then that can shift things, actually, that can change things. So the Buddha didn't have a story about this person as an assassin. He didn't relate to them as they were expecting to be related to. So there's partly about the stories that we have are co-created, and if you don't engage in somebody else's story, it's possible to change the situation. So the Buddha was fearless. And one of the things that the Buddha wasn't afraid of was his own death. The Buddha wasn't afraid of death. And that meant that he, in his final weeks and months, was very selfless, actually. He lived his final weeks and months as he lived the rest of his life, which was basically serving other people and devoted to other people. And so the Buddha, one of the Buddha's qualities that was very inspiring is selflessness. Or generosity, and the symbol this is a standing picture of the Buddha doing the fearless mudra in Nagaloka in India, and it's a huge statue, and I really like it because it has a sense of a Mahapurush, a big guy who's not afraid. But this is the Buddha with the gesture of generosity, of dana, so an outstretched hand, an open hand. Not holding back, not being tight-fisted or stingy, but an open hand, just freely sharing whatever will benefit people. And and in the last weeks and months of the Buddha's life, it's a very, very inspiring account, and we hear some of that. In each February we have a festival where we bring to mind the final weeks and months of the death of the Buddha. And what you hear is of the Buddha in serious pain, actually, in discomfort. He has got it begins with very, very bad case of diarrhoea and dysentery, very, very lot of serious pain for the Buddha and discomfort. And his concern throughout the whole episode was about other people, so he was selfless in how he lived and how he died. But his first concern was for the person who cooked the meal that gave him food poisoning. He didn't want them to feel guilty. So he made sure that this person was reassured, didn't feel guilty that they were potentially going to kill the Buddha. He put them at ease. And then heroically he continues on foot with Ananda, just visiting place to place in a lot of discomfort and pain, but just bearing it mindfully and with compassion, and just making sure people understood his teaching, making sure people were clear about his teaching. Because in a sense he knew what was best for humanity was that his teachings would survive after his death, and he wanted to make sure that the communities would thrive and that they really understood his teaching. So he spent his final weeks and months making sure, walking from place to place, making sure people understood. And his whole life was an act of generosity. And I was really moved today just thinking, well, how much have I benefited from that, from the Buddha leaving this legacy of his life and his teaching, his example? How much has my life been transformed and changed by the Buddha's generosity and selflessness? And how many millions and millions of other lives have been directly affected by being able to practice the teachings of the Buddha, that act, this generous act of the Buddha, just sharing his teachings, making sure they were available to lots and lots of people. And how many, how much has your lives been affected by the teachings of the Buddha? And I think, directly, but also indirectly, how many other people have been affected by us practicing the teachings of the Buddha, and how many people throughout the last 2,500 years have been affected by other people practicing Buddhism. It's quite, very moving, and for me, mind-blowing just to think of the impact of the Buddha's life of service, actually, of selflessness, of sharing, making his teachings available in whatever way people needed them. So I've already mentioned how he reassured Ananda when he was dying. The Buddha was on his deathbed, Ananda was upset, and the Buddha was concerned that Ananda wouldn't be upset, that Ananda would be comforted and confident and reassured. And then just as the Buddha was close to death, a follower searching for the Buddha, similar to Bahia, a follower called Subhuddha wanted to be taught by the Buddha. And the Buddha's followers were trying to keep Subhuddha away from the Buddha, just to stop the Buddha from being harassed. But the Buddha found out about it and called for Subhuddha to be brought to him. And he gave Subhuddha a teaching, and he ordained Subhuddha as his kind of final follower, his final monk. So, even to the extent of the Buddha, it was really, really hot, and the Buddha was suffering with diarrhea, and he was being fanned by a monk to keep him cool. But the Buddha was concerned that there were beings that the humans couldn't see, that had come to see the Buddha as he died. And their view was being obstructed by this big monk fanning the Buddha. So he asked the Buddha not to fan him, because he wanted all the non-human beings to be able to see the Buddha, as well as the human beings as he was dying. So, there's lots. The Buddha gave a list of different ways you could be generous and selfless. And one, you can give lots of different things. One is possessions, and the Buddha didn't have possessions to give. But there's time and energy, and the Buddha gave all of his time and all of his energy to other people. You can give the gift of fearlessness, and that's certainly something that, the example of the assassins and other stories, the Buddha stopped people from being frightened, he stopped people from being afraid, he gave them courage, and that's a really important gift that you can give people. You can even give life and limb, you can give your life, or your limb for other people, your limbs. But the Buddha said the most important thing, the most precious and valuable thing you can give to other people is the Dharma, the teaching of the path to freedom, because actually that's what will stop them from suffering. That empowers other people to prevent their own suffering. So the most vital, the most important thing you can give to other people is the Dharma. So the last thing I want to draw out is just the Buddha as a teacher, the Buddha who taught other people. So this is the final hand gesture, which is something like this. And it's said to be the wheel-turning gesture, so it's usually dynamic, something like that. But if you imagine a wheel being turned. And the Buddha said that when he first taught the Dharma, he set in motion a wheel. And every time the Dharma is passed on from person to person, that wheel continues turning. And so for 2,500 years, that wheel of the Dharma has continued to be turned. And this is the gesture of teaching, which you'll see on a lot of Buddha statues, the one that we sell downstairs have got this gesture. And the Buddha taught in many different ways. He taught in parables and stories, he taught with gestures, he taught with giving people practices, he taught people very direct views and teachings like he gave to Bahia. He even sometimes set up situations so people would learn from those situations. There's lots of examples which I really like where the people weren't receptive to a teaching, so the Buddha created a situation where they would learn a lesson from that situation. So he had all kinds of different ways of teaching people. He even used his death as a teaching. This is how remarkable a teacher he was. But there was an older member, Savananda, gave a talk at a recent order gathering, and he said that the Buddha's death was the ultimate performance art, because his final teaching was all things are impermanent, and then he died. So it's basically, you can't get much of a more vivid message than that. Basically, all things are impermanent, and then the Buddha's not there anymore. So it's very, very striking. The Buddha knew how to get a message across. He knew how to teach, and he taught in all kinds of different ways. And he taught anybody that wanted to hear. When he first became enlightened, it said that what he exclaimed was, "Open are the doors to the deathless, to those who have ears. Open are the doors to the deathless, to those who have ears." So basically anybody who wanted to hear, the Buddha taught. And he taught all kinds of people. It was very, very different to the norm in Indian society. He taught women as well as men. Women weren't supposed to be taught at that time. He taught women as well as men. He taught poor people from low caste, he taught high caste people, he taught kings, he taught prostitutes, beggars. He taught anybody who wanted to listen, and sometimes people that didn't want to listen, he taught them as well. He had ways of making people hear, including his son, Rahula. Buddha had a son called Rahula, who was a baby when he first left to go on a quest. It's another completely different story, but the Buddha left home to go on a spiritual quest. And in 6 years in him becoming the Buddha. So when he returned back to his home city, his son was 7. He had a 7-year-old son called Rahula. And his son's mother, had sent Rahula to the Buddha to ask for his inheritance because she wanted the Buddha to hand over his inheritance, all of his rights to his son. So he came to the Buddha and said, "Give me my inheritance." And what the Buddha gave him wasn't what his mother was expecting, because he ordained him as one of his followers, one of his monks, and taught him the path of the Dharma. So basically what he inherited from the Buddha was enlightenment, and when his son was 21, he became an enlightened disciple of the Buddha. But it wasn't, the Buddha taught people who didn't necessarily come expecting that they were going to be taught. Get a lot of accounts of that. So the Buddha wasn't interested in being nice, he wasn't interested in convention, he was interested in what would benefit people, what would stop them from suffering. And he gave them wherever he could what would stop them from suffering. And that is what compassion is, really. That is what true compassion is preventing people suffering, giving them what they need to no longer suffer. That's what compassion is. And it can be very direct, like when the Buddha and Ananda helped the sick monk, or it can be at its highest, giving people what they need to empower themselves to no longer suffer. Yeah, there's another time the Buddha went to a family wedding. He was invited to a wedding of his family, and he had a cousin called Nanda who was getting married. And on his wedding night, the Buddha left his begging bowl. He was seated next to Nanda as guest of honour, and Nanda ended up following the Buddha to give his begging bowl back. But the Buddha kept on walking, and eventually Nanda arrived where the Buddha's community was, and to cut a long story short, he became a disciple of the Buddha as well. So I think his family probably stopped inviting him to family gatherings after that. He did have a good relationship with his family, and a lot of them became enlightened. But he basically didn't care about convention, he wanted people to awaken. So I've talked a long time, I'll close there, but just to summarise, we need to have a clear understanding of the goal and how we're going to get there, otherwise we won't make progress. This is really important, just not to be vague about the Dharma life or the spiritual life and I'm just going to do the practices. We need to have a sense of what we want, what we're heading towards, who we want to become. And it might be the Buddha, it might be something else, it might be a spiritual friend, it might be the Buddha, it might be another symbol of enlightenment. We're going to hear over the next few weeks different symbols of the goal. The Buddha is one symbol of the goal, for me a very, very potent and powerful symbol of the goal, but there are other symbols of the goal. And a couple of caveats, and then a metaphor, and then I promise I'll stop then. So the dangers and caveats are that the danger of seeing a statue, we often see a statue of the Buddha like we've got here, like here, and there's a danger of seeing the Buddha as just being in isolation. So we can see enlightenment as just being in isolation, and that's why for me that painting of the Buddha and Ananda is a really lovely one, because it shows the Buddha in his kind of true relationship. It doesn't show enlightenment as being about just me and my enlightenment and this solitary figure on his own. It shows the Buddha practicing friendship and living out friendship. But there's a danger, you could see the Buddha just being in isolation and get the wrong idea of the goal. But there's a danger, I suppose, when you try and imagine the goal, you could put the goal so far away that it's unobtainable, and that is a danger. And I think that happened with Christianity. You could say that happened with Christianity, or Subhuti says that happened with Christianity, and I'm copying him. But I think it's true, actually, that the idea of God puts the goal so far away that it's not possible to transform. You can't kind of grow and become like God. You're a sinner, basically. So there's danger in having the goal so removed, so far removed. But there's also a danger of having the goal so close that it's quite superficial and it's not very effective. So we can have the goal of, we just want to become a bit more like me, but a bit better. So my aim of practice is just to be, like me, but a bit less stressed, or like me, but a bit more generous. And again, well, the danger is that we won't really be motivated to do very much with our lives because we're already like me, but a bit less generous than we want to be. So it's like, it's not a very inspiring goal. It's not going to really transform us or arouse us. But the Buddha is a intermediate. Is somewhere as a goal which doesn't fall into either of those categories. The Buddha is a human being, a historical human being. Well, we can imagine ourselves overcoming what he overcame. We can imagine ourselves attaining what he attained. So it's not so far removed as to be, desirable to move towards. But he is also, there's something unknowable and mysterious about the Buddha, which can't be grasped and can't be put down into stories or symbols or hand gestures or teachings. There's something unknowable and ungraspable about the Buddha, something mysterious. So if we have the Buddha as a goal, it stops it from being kind of just a bit like me or a bit superficial. So I just want to end with, I was thinking this morning of another friend, Padmavajra, who lives at Padmaloka, who comes twice a year to our centre. And I was thinking just of some of his qualities when I was this afternoon, and I was kind of lying with my eyes closed on my bed, thinking of Padmavajra and his qualities. I was thinking it's almost like there's something bigger shining through Padmavajra. Those qualities, they evoke for me something bigger which is shining through Padmavajra. When I think about him and his generosity, his kindness, his energy, it's almost like there are bigger qualities shining through him. And I opened my eyes and what I saw was a stained glass Amitabha Buddha, red Buddha, which we'll hear more about in a couple of weeks, this figure. But Amoghavanksa gave me this stained glass Buddha, and I had it on my window, and the red light was streaming through it. And it just really evokes this image, this idea of a stained glass Buddha. Evokes, well, there's something bigger which shines through these symbols of enlightenment, these symbols of the goal. And that's what's important. Whatever the symbol of the goal is for you, it's important that it becomes illumined by something bigger, something mysterious, something transcendental. So it could be the Buddha, it could be a spiritual friend, it could be another symbol of enlightenment, but the important thing is that it evokes and moves you with something of this light of something from beyond, something bigger. Okay. So whatever symbol does it for you, make sure it's illumined by something bigger. So it could be John Barnes, it could be a spiritual friend, it could be the Buddha, depending where you're at. But it's important that you're energized and inspired to act, and that it draws, this symbol of the goal draws out your qualities, your latent qualities, so that you've got a clear idea of the goal and a clear idea of how to get there.